This all started one ordinary Friday, a day just like any other. I was working in a downtown office building, the kind with the reflective windows that stretch far into the sky, trapping people in their tiny cubicles like some sterile glass prison. My job wasn't too stressful, but it required focus. Every day felt like a rerun of the day before. Wake up early, go to work, sit in front of a computer for 8 hours, then head home, collapse into bed, and repeat. It wasn't glamorous or exciting, but it paid the bills. That Friday, I remember glancing at the clock on my computer screen. It was 4:45 p.m., 15 more minutes until the weekend would officially begin. The office was unusually quiet for a Friday. Most people had left early, excited to get a head start on their plans. I, on the other hand, was still stuck at my desk, tidying up some last-minute reports. That's when I noticed him for the first time. It was a subtle thing at first. Out of the corner of my eye, through the narrow slit between the blinds, I saw a man standing on the sidewalk across the street. He was just standing there, motionless. A tall guy, wearing a black coat, his features obscured by shadows from the nearby buildings. I couldn't make out much, just that he was standing completely still, facing directly toward my office window. I figured he was probably waiting for someone, so I brushed it off. 5 minutes passed. I checked the clock again. The man was still there, in the exact same position. His rigid stance began to gnaw at me, a small seed of unease taking root in my gut. It's not normal for someone to stand that still for that long. Maybe he was on his phone, I thought. People get lost in their devices all the time. But when I looked again, his hands weren't moving and he wasn't holding anything. He was just standing and looking. I forced myself to focus on finishing the report, but my concentration was fractured. Every few seconds, my gaze would drift back to the window, and there he was, unmoved, unblinking, staring. Finally, 5 p.m. hit, and I quickly shut down my computer, grabbed my bag, and bolted out of the office. When I stepped out of the building, I hesitated for a second. I wanted to look for the man, to confirm he was just some random person, maybe a weirdo, but harmless. But I didn't look. Something inside me screamed not to. Instead, I turned on my heels and headed straight for the subway. I felt a twinge of guilt for not confronting my fear head-on, but it was quickly drowned out by the familiar hum of the city. The streets were bustling with people, and the noise of traffic and conversation should have been comforting. Yet, as I walked toward the subway station, the unsettling feeling didn't fade. I could feel eyes on me. Maybe it was just my nerves, or maybe, no, I told myself it was nothing. Just a guy standing around, no big deal. The subway was as packed as always during rush hour, a mass of bodies pressing together in the dimly lit underground. I found a spot to stand, holding onto the pole as the train lurched forward. The sense of unease lingered, but I told myself it was just the stress of the week catching up to me. Still, I couldn't shake the thought of that man on the sidewalk. When I got home to my small apartment, I locked the door behind me and exhaled. Finally, the weekend. I didn't have any grand plans, just the usual. A movie, maybe some takeout, and then catching up on sleep. I shrugged off my coat and tossed my bag onto the couch, trying to forget the strange encounter. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. Every time I walked past the windows, I felt compelled to check outside, half expecting to see him standing there again. But the street outside my apartment was empty, save for a few passing cars and the occasional pedestrian. I kept telling myself to let it go, that it was nothing, but the unease gnawed at me. Later that night, I crawled into bed and turned off the lights. My apartment was small, cozy even, and normally it felt like a safe haven after a long week. But not tonight. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the image of that man standing on the sidewalk, the way he had been so still. Too still. I told myself it was just my imagination. I hadn't been sleeping well, and my mind was playing tricks on me. I closed my eyes, willing myself to relax, but sleep didn't come easily. When I finally drifted off, it was into a restless, fragmented slumber. And then I woke up. It was sudden, like someone had flipped a switch in my brain. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone. The room was silent, but it felt wrong. Off. My skin prickled with that same sensation I'd felt earlier, like someone was watching me. My bedroom window was just a few feet away, and the blinds were drawn, but I could see a faint glow from the streetlight outside seeping through the edges. I lay there, frozen, listening to the silence. My breath felt loud, too loud. And then, without thinking, I glanced toward the window. I couldn't see much, just the outline of the blinds against the dim light outside. But there was something else, something that didn't belong. A shadow, faint but unmistakable, standing just outside the window. I couldn't make out the details, but I knew it was him, the man from earlier, standing there watching. My heart raced as I slowly pulled the covers up to my chin, my mind racing through the possibilities. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or maybe I was still half dreaming. But deep down, I knew the truth. He had followed me. I woke up the next morning drenched in sweat. The vivid memory of the shadow outside my window was still fresh in my mind, and my heart raced just thinking about it. I tried to shake off the feeling that had followed me into the daylight, but it clung to me like a second skin. As I got out of bed and glanced around my apartment, everything felt wrong, familiar, but off. I went over to the window where I had seen the shadow the night before. In the light of day, it seemed ridiculous to think that someone had been standing there, watching me in the dead of night. But when I pulled the blinds back, I couldn't help but feel a sinking sense of dread as I stared at the street below. It was empty now, peaceful in the morning sun, but the memory of the figure watching me from the shadows was hard to dismiss. I had to get out of the apartment. I needed fresh air, something to shake off this growing paranoia. So, I decided to head out for a walk, hoping that the noise and chaos of the city would snap me back to reality. But as I left my apartment building and stepped onto the sidewalk, I felt eyes on me again. I walked faster, weaving through the busy weekend crowds, trying to lose myself in the sea of people. Yet, no matter how many blocks I covered, the sensation never faded. It was as though I was being hunted. I told myself I was being paranoid, just a little jumpy after a weird night. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Then I saw him. I was crossing the street when I caught sight of the same man from yesterday, the one who had been standing outside my office. He was standing at the corner, half hidden in the shade of a building, watching me. That same black coat, that same unsettling stillness. My stomach twisted in knots as I pretended not to notice him, quickening my pace as I turned the corner. I ducked into a coffee shop a block away, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself that this was ridiculous. It was just a coincidence. Big city, random people, nothing more. I ordered a coffee, sat by the window and tried to calm myself down. But then I saw him again, this time across the street. He wasn't even trying to hide now. He just stood there, staring in my direction. My hands shook as I gripped the cup, hot coffee spilling over the edge. I forced myself to think logically. What could he want? Why was he following me? Was this some kind of sick joke? The questions swirled around my mind, but no answers came. I stayed in the coffee shop for over an hour, hoping that when I left, he would be gone. But when I finally gathered the courage to walk out, my heart sank. He was still there, standing a little further down the street, just far enough away that it could still be considered a coincidence, but close enough that I knew it wasn't. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront him. My pulse raced as I walked toward him, trying to muster some sense of bravado. But the closer I got, the more my legs felt like jelly. As I approached, he didn't move. He didn't flinch. He just stood there, his face still obscured in shadow. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking slightly. "What the hell do you want?" No response. He stood there, silent, like a statue. My heart was beating so loudly I thought it might explode. I took another step closer, but something stopped me. Something about him, something primal in my gut, told me not to get too close. The way he stood, unnaturally still, as if he didn't even breathe. I could feel cold sweat trickling down my back. He didn't say a word. His head tilted slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if studying me. Then, in one smooth motion, he turned and started walking away. His steps were slow, deliberate, and eerily calm. For a moment, I stood there frozen, watching him disappear into the crowd. I wanted to chase after him, demand answers, but my feet wouldn't move. My mind screamed at me to let him go. I finally exhaled, realizing I had been holding my breath the whole time. My legs were shaky as I stumbled back to my apartment. Once inside, I locked the door behind me and double-checked the windows. My body was trembling from a combination of fear and adrenaline. Who was this man? Why was he following me? And why did he seem so inhuman? Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Everywhere I went, I felt his presence lurking just out of sight. At work, I found myself constantly glancing out the window, half expecting to see him standing on the sidewalk again. On the subway, I scanned the faces of the passengers, searching for a hint of that black coat in the crowded train. And at home, I avoided looking out the windows altogether. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, that I was overreacting. But the paranoia was suffocating. I barely slept. My dreams were filled with shadowy figures and the overwhelming sensation of being chased. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside made my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that, at any moment, I'd look up and see him standing in the corner of the room. Then one night, it escalated. I had been tossing and turning in bed, unable to sleep. It was well past midnight, and the apartment was silent except for the occasional hum of traffic outside. I decided to get up and get a drink of water, hoping that maybe it would calm my nerves. As I stepped into the kitchen, I glanced at the window over the sink. My heart stopped. There he was, standing across the street, directly facing my building, illuminated by the dim glow of the streetlights. His black coat seemed to blend into the darkness around him, but there was no mistaking it. It was him. And this time, I could see his face. Or at least, I thought I could. It wasn't right. His features were wrong, distorted somehow. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes, they were too dark, like pits of nothingness that seemed to swallow the light. He didn't blink, didn't move, just stood there, staring up at my apartment. I backed away from the window, my pulse racing in my ears. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking as I dialed the police. They answered quickly, but my voice was barely coherent as I tried to explain the situation. A man, outside my apartment watching me. I didn't care if they thought I was crazy. I needed help. They told me to stay on the line and sent a patrol car to my location. I hid in the corner of my living room, clutching the phone like a lifeline, my eyes glued to the window. The minutes stretched on like hours, but eventually, I heard the wail of sirens outside. I dared to peek out the window. The man was gone. The police arrived, and I tried to explain everything to them. The man, the stalking, the way he'd been following me. But there was no sign of him, no evidence to back up my claims. They did a quick sweep of the area, but found nothing out of the ordinary. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, just nothing. They told me to lock my doors, stay vigilant, and call again if anything suspicious happened. Then they left, leaving me alone in my apartment once more. But I knew deep down that this wasn't over. Whoever or whatever he wasn't done with me yet. And the worst part? I had no idea what he wanted. Someone we didn't know tried to pick Dylan up from school today, said his elementary teacher. The guy said he was Dylan's older brother. Dylan doesn't have a brother, I said, alarmed. We thought so too, replied the teacher. I suspected something wasn't right straight away. It was this tall, lanky guy with black hair. Looked in his late 30s, maybe even 40. He knew your address, Dylan's full name and birthday, and which class he was in. I went inside to check with the principal. When I came back out, the guy was gone. I was silent for a second as I stood facing the teacher outside the school gate. The gate separated the main road and a large playground and basketball court leading into the school. All the other kids and parents had left, and we were the only ones standing outside. Where's Dylan now? I asked. He's waiting for you in the principal's office, she said, gesturing for me to follow as she turned around. I walked across the playground behind her shakily, then through the corridors to the office. My 8-year-old son Dylan sat on the couch in the principal's office, still as a stone. The principal sat behind her desk, and there was a cop standing next to her. Hey buddy, I said, you okay? Dylan looked at me blankly. My Dylan was always a quiet boy. It was just the two of us at home at the time. I was a single dad. My late wife Angie, Dylan's mother, died a year prior. She'd been hit by a car while cycling around a sharp bend, and they never identified the driver. I won't go into any more detail here, as frankly I'd rather not relive that period, but safe to say it destroyed me. I tried to pick up the pieces and stay strong for Dylan. Was I doing a good job? Only God knows. I received no feedback. Since then, Dylan became even more withdrawn, pretty much remaining silent until spoken to. He was seen by a child psychologist and various other members of the welfare team at school, but after assessment they were sure he didn't have autism or the like. He could speak up when he was pressed. He was just shy and preferred to keep to himself. The cop confirmed I was Dylan's dad, then asked me a few questions. He finally told us they'd try and find the guy and to report if we ever saw him again. The principal and teacher said a few things. It was a blur. All I remember is sweating profusely with my knees shaking, trying to comprehend the fact that someone had tried to kidnap my son. "Dylan, you didn't know that man, did you?" asked the principal. Dylan shook his head. I was on edge after that day. Dylan was my whole world, all the family I had left, and I couldn't stand the possibility that he could be in danger. It made me sick. Who was this bastard? Why my son? Did he know us, or was it some random creep? I always walked Dylan to and from school thereafter, and was never late to pick him up again. Meanwhile, Dylan himself didn't seem rattled in the slightest. He never mentioned the incident unless specifically asked. At the time, I thought he was just timid and didn't want to cause trouble. A couple of weeks later, after the incident, the same homeroom teacher called me during her lunch break. She said one of the kids in her class saw Dylan talking to a man through the school fence. When she rushed out, the man was gone. When Dylan was asked about it, he said he hadn't been talking to anyone. The girl who apparently spotted him was questioned further, and she was adamant she saw Dylan talking to a tall, lanky man with messy black hair. The cops were called again, did a quick search of the perimeter of the school, but they found no one suspicious. That afternoon, I sat Dylan down at the kitchen table. "I won't get angry. I just need you to tell me the truth," I said, trying to steady my nerves. "Did you or didn't you talk to a stranger today at school? Yes or no?" He shrugged. Getting an answer out of him was harder than drawing blood from a stone. "How many times have we told you not to talk to strangers? It's for your own safety. You do understand that, don't you, son?" He nodded, looking slightly afraid. I realized I had raised my voice and felt guilty immediately. Exasperated and running on 2 hours of sleep, I left him at the dining table and went straight to bed. That night, I woke at 2 a.m. and went for a bathroom trip. I decided to check on Dylan while I was at it. He wasn't in his room. I called out his name and looked around in the living room and kitchen, getting more frantic as the seconds ticked by. I checked wardrobes, corners, even in cupboards which made no sense to look in as he'd never fit in them. But I was desperate, thinking he'd been kidnapped. I went out into the street, yelling his name as I ran up and down it like a maniac, to no avail. As I came back into the house ready to call the police, I looked in Dylan's room for one last check. He was sitting up on his bed, wide awake and staring back at me. "Where were you?" I asked, relieved, but still alarmed. "I was here," he replied. "No, you weren't. I was looking everywhere for you, and you weren't in here." I was. Had I imagined all of that? I shook my head, feeling a migraine coming on. "Just stay in your room, okay? Don't scare me." I thought my eyes had deceived me somehow, and the paranoia to me. Perhaps I should have paid attention to the fact that the window was wide open. About a year after those incidents, I heard a knock at my apartment door. I was inside doing some paperwork while Dylan was in his room playing Minecraft. I was on alert immediately. No one ever knocked on the door. We lived in a block of apartments, and friends or acquaintances would always wait outside the main door, ring the doorbell, and I would greet them downstairs. This guy's name was Gregory. He seemed to bounce around from place to place with no permanent address, even traveling between states and doing petty crimes like theft, harassment, and occasionally stalking minors. When they did a more thorough search, it turns out he had been involved in at least one gruesome murder in a different state and ended up being given a life sentence for it, along with his accomplices. I wouldn't have wished that terror upon anyone, but these unfortunate things happen. The side effects of the psychological damage I experienced that day have never left me. However, I know people who have been through similar horrors but never lived to tell the tale. So I looked on the bright side and counted myself lucky. Where there are sick freaks, there will be victims. The sicko was in jail, and I thought that was the end of it. But there was a different side to the story that I only uncovered 10 years after the incident. Dylan was due to leave for college, living away from home for the first time. He had grown into a tall kid with a surpassing number of friends, still obedient, but relentlessly quiet. While packing his things and clearing out his room, I found a rugged-looking old notebook at the back of his bottom drawer. "Dylan's diary," said the cover. I flicked through it with no intention to pry initially, and saw that he had written and drawn in it extensively, with impressively neat handwriting. He had always been a boy of few words, so I was intrigued. I began reading from the first page. Page 1. Cody's house, 11 a.m. He has to give me back my coat. There were a few stick figure drawings. Page 2. I need a book for English class next week. Ask if Amy has one. I turned the pages, and the first few were filled with the same mundane elementary school day-to-day affairs, mixed in with a few doodles. Then I got to page 21. Page 21. Why does my dad talk so much? He won't even let me get an Xbox, and he won't let me sleep over at Cody's house. Talking back is no use. I hate him. I felt a sting, and my heart sank. I remembered that day vividly, and a pang of guilt ran through me. I turned the page. Page 22. Saw Greg today? He says he can help me get rid of Dad. I said he was lying, but he says he's done it before. It was in the news. As my mind connected the dots, I flicked through the previous pages. This was the first mention of Greg I could find. I started to sweat, but continued reading. Page 23. Me and Greg are coming up with a plan. Need Dad gone. But I almost got caught talking to him today. Mrs. Watford, that stupid old mole rat, kept asking me. She took me to the principal's office again. I think Katie saw Greg and snitched. Need to be careful. A few blank pages, with a few in between, filled with scribbles and admin-type notes to self. Then the narrative continued. Page 41. The word plan was underlined, with 2 drawings underneath. The first was of a stick figure, kneeling by a door, holding what looked like a dagger. This stick figure was smiling. There was another stick figure behind the door, with its hand on the door handle, about to open the door. The second was of the first stick figure, stabbing the stick man who had just opened the door. His eyes now 2 crosses. Page 42. Greg came to my house and I showed him my plan. He said it was good and he could do it. We almost got caught by Dad, but I got back in bed just in time. He's gonna get some tools from his house. Close 1. Page 43. Greg screwed up. He's in jail now. Why did Dad not open the door when Greg knocked? Everything went wrong. I don't know why. Page 44. I wish my dad would just shut up. I flicked through the rest of the notebook, which was blank. Page 44 was the last entry. I read the entries a few times and pondered what I should do. I never thought Dylan was capable of such heinous intentions. Confused and upset, I acted as if nothing had happened for a few days, but on the day he was due to leave for college, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I brought his duffel bag down and hooked it on his suitcase. He was ready to head to the station, standing outside the door with the suitcase and his backpack. Dylan, when you were younger, did I ever say or do anything that hurt you? You can be honest with me. No, why do you ask? He replied. I held up the diary. He froze for a second, and I saw the color drain from his face. I won't blame you for anything, don't worry. You know I love you very much, son. You were a minor, and you were a victim of a very sick man. Besides, this thing is years old. I just want to know what I did wrong at the time to lead to this, and we can put it behind us. His shocked expression faded, leaving his ever-present blank stare. You didn't do anything wrong. Neither did Mom. I opened my mouth to ask him what he meant by that, but stopped. The corners of his mouth stretched into a wide smile. Our eyes met and we stood in silence for a few seconds. Dylan, if I were to find another one of these notebooks, I began tactfully, would I see the blueprint of my wife's murder inside? Yeah. He didn't even pause to answer. Then he gripped the handle of his suitcase and walked off down the street. That was 2 years ago now. I never forgave him. Every night I still lie awake thinking whether he was born that way or it's somehow my fault. We haven't talked since he left that day, and he hasn't come back home. He's never tried to contact me, and I haven't likewise. It looks like he's doing well in college from his Facebook posts. He seems to have a lot of friends, so I assume he got his own place or stays with one of them. I wonder if any of them will ever find out who he really is. Wouldn't blame them if they never do. After all, I still don't know who my son is, and I raised him for 18 years. My older brother, Shane, had spent the last 10 years in prison, and it looked like he might be in there for the rest of his life. However, he called me recently to say that they were opening up a new early release program, and they would let him out immediately on a probationary period if he agreed to participate. Some sort of new process, an ethical alteration to prevent future criminal activity. God, how I wish now that he had just told them no. Growing up, Shane was my hero. My mom has had a rough life. She got pregnant with Shane when she was 16, and her parents kicked her out of the house for it. Afterwards, she went to live with Shane's father, who was in his early 20s, and had a small apartment in the worst part of the city, and he treated her terribly, forcing her to drop out of school and get several jobs so he could spend the majority of his time drinking and partying, hitting her whenever she stepped out of line. But she was terrified of raising a baby alone. She tried her best to make it work with him, but it just wasn't enough. When she started showing, he realized that he didn't want to be a dad and kicked her out too. Faced with the prospect of living on the streets, she lied about her age and managed to secure a lease from a landlord in a nearby building that preferred not to ask questions as long as she paid the rent. When Shane was born, she did her best. As she was only 17 and without an education beyond the 10th grade, she continued to work multiple minimum wage jobs and didn't have much time to spend with her new son. Until he was around 6, Shane mostly stayed with an older widow, Roberta, that lived across the hall from them and was sympathetic to their situation. Then, Roberta died, and Mom decided that Shane was old enough to just stay home alone while she was working, or increasingly, staying out late with friends or on dates. Mom fell hard into drugs and drinking to cope with her situation, and took comfort in the worst men. None of them ever stuck around for more than a few months, but even still, many of them left their marks on my mother and on Shane. Coming of age in this environment of loneliness, poverty, and violence, Shane was a troubled child. He was constantly in detention at school, getting in fights with other kids, stealing, and generally raising hell around the neighborhood. That is, until I came along. One of Mom's short-lived flings resulted in her second pregnancy, another boy, and I was born a little over 2 months after Shane's 12th birthday. Seeing that she wasn't going to change her ways overnight and become Mother of the Year, he took it upon himself to be my primary parental figure. He changed my diapers, did the weekly shopping, fed me, bathed me, cooked, cleaned. He did everything that he could to make my childhood better than his had been. It became his mission in life to be the father that neither of us had ever had. At school, he opened up a little bootleg shop out of his locker where he'd sell candy, trading cards, snacks, and once he was in high school, cigarettes and liquor, just to make a little extra money to buy me clothes and toys. And then, when he turned 16, he took a job at a local auto shop, working on cars in the evenings after classes to help pay the rent and our other bills. I never understood where he found the energy to do it all. It was around this time that I started school myself. He packed my lunch every day and made sure that I got on the bus in the morning. With his supplemental income, Mom was able to quit one of her jobs to be home to get me off the bus at the end of the day and to make dinner at night. Now, I'm not sure if he said something to her, or if it was just her seeing him picking up so much of her slack, but she began to sober up a little and made more of an effort to be a mother to me than she had with him. It was too late for her to repair much of her relationship with Shane, but I began not to dread the time that I had to spend alone with her. After he graduated, Shane went to work full-time as a mechanic in the shop and started making decent money. With his grades, he could have gone to college, moved away and studied something interesting, made something of himself. But it wasn't even a thought in his mind. His dream was for me to go to college, for me to grow up and do something important. All he wanted to do was save up enough money that he could buy us all a small place out in the suburbs and put me through school. So he continued to work his ass off, and Mom picked up more hours too. They both put money away each month into our future fund. And I ended up having a largely normal childhood while we counted down the days until we could get out of our crappy apartment. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and that was enough. And just when it looked like we were finally going to be able to make it happen, something terrible happened. When I was 14, Shane got arrested. He was always looking for opportunities to make extra cash, to help us save up faster and start our new life. And his boss, Mr. Franks, would give him side work sometimes. Mostly, this involved him driving one of the cars from the shop and dropping off or picking up a package here or there. He never knew what was in these packages, nor did he care to ask, but he was always well compensated for his efforts. Then, one night, Mr. Franks told him that he had a slightly different assignment. Shane was to drive an associate of Mr. Franks to a house, drop him off, wait for him to come back out, and then take him right back to where he picked him up originally. That was all the information Shane had, but it seemed like a simple enough task, and he would be making double his normal fee for doing it, so he agreed. Things went all right for the first half of the evening. Shane picked up Mr. Franks' friend at the address Mr. Franks supplied, and the man gave him directions on where to go next. They didn't speak beyond him grunting, "Go left here. Right here. Take the next exit," at Shane every so often, and they never exchanged names. It was a little over an hour before he directed Shane to kill the headlights and pull into the driveway of a home well outside the city. The man gave him strict instructions to stay inside the vehicle and leave the engine running in case they needed to make a quick getaway before exiting and slinking nimbly towards the house. At this point, Shane was apprehensive. He debated simply leaving the man behind and driving back to the city. Yet, he knew the money was going to be enough to put us over the edge and we'd finally be able to get our house. So, he sat quietly and waited, telling himself that the man was just breaking in to steal something, or maybe take some compromising photos of someone. But with the windows down, Shane then heard something that made his stomach drop. Several quick pops came from inside the house, and Shane looked up to see flashes of light in the upstairs window, corresponding with them. Gunshots. Shane panicked. He threw on the headlights and tried to turn the car around as quickly as he could. No amount of money was worth him getting involved in whatever he was currently involved in, and he was just getting ready to punch the accelerator and fly out of the driveway when a loud bang on the passenger door made him jump. The man was wrenching the door open forcefully and dove into the seat, screaming at Shane to drive and get us the fuck out of here. Seeing no other options, Shane obliged and whipped back out onto the road while the man kept yelling expletives. Shane realized that he was in severe pain, and when they passed under a street lamp, he saw that the man was clutching his stomach and his hands were covered in blood. "Fuck, motherfucker shot me. Shit, I'm losing a lot of blood. I'm not feeling too good." His voice was faltering with each word he spoke, and he suddenly slumped over against the window. Shane tried to shake him, told him to wake up, but he got no response. Not knowing what to do, he searched for the nearest hospital on his phone and followed the directions to it. He parked on the curb near the emergency entrance and dragged the man inside, announcing loudly that he'd been shot and needed help. Several doctors and nurses helped load the man onto a gurney and wheeled him back into surgery while they started asking Shane questions about him. What was his name? How old was he? How was he shot? Shane couldn't give them any answers. He was in somewhat of a state of shock, and his mind wasn't processing information quickly enough. He couldn't think of a believable reason on the spot for why he had a man that'd been shot in his vehicle, and simply opted to tell them that he didn't know and asked if he could leave. They told him that because he'd brought in a gunshot victim, that he'd have to wait to speak with the police and handed him off to hospital security. While he waited for the officers to arrive, he thought of calling Mr. Franks, but he couldn't get away from security to have a private conversation. So he just sat quietly and tried to think of a good story. What he came up with was that he had been driving nearby when the man flagged him down at an intersection, and Shane had simply pulled over to help, only to then realize that the man was gravely injured. It might have been flimsy, but he didn't think they'd have any way to prove otherwise, and just hoped he'd have a chance to speak to the man before the cops did so they could corroborate each other. However, it didn't much matter what excuse Shane came up with, as he was arrested as soon as the officers arrived, before he could even give his weak fabrication. It turned out that the house Shane and the man had gone to belonged to a detective. And it turned out that that detective had been investigated, Mr. Franks, for drug smuggling. Shane had unknowingly driven the man to an execution, and the execution had gone horribly wrong. The detective heard their car pull into his driveway and was armed and waiting when the man broke into his bedroom. They'd exchanged several shots with one another, and the detective had been fatally hit in the head while his wife took a round to the chest. The executioner must have thought she was dead, or was so flustered at having been shot himself that he didn't make sure she was gone before leaving the house. She'd been able to call 911 and explain what happened before expiring herself. Given she'd told them that her husband managed to shoot their attacker, the police had been put on high alert for any gunshot wounds arriving at local hospitals. And when they relayed all this information to Shane as they arrested him, he broke down and confessed to the whole thing. Unfortunately for Shane, the executioner didn't make it. Shane tried to explain to the officers that he had no idea what was going to happen when they drove to the house, but they wouldn't hear any of it. Mr. Franks was arrested too, but he of course had an alibi for the night, and they couldn't find any evidence to tie him to hiring the man. What's worse, Mr. Franks tried to pin the whole thing on Shane. As Mr. Franks explained it to police, he had complained to his employee that the deceased detective had been annoying him and making his business difficult. He had no idea that Shane would try to kill him over it. The evidence showed that Shane had been driving the car, and there was nothing forensically to tie him to actually being in the house or having pulled the trigger. So they charged him with accessory to murder. With his word against Mr. Franks and no hard evidence either way, they didn't believe they could prove that Shane had indeed planned the whole thing. But they could definitely prove that he'd helped the murderer kill a detective and his wife in cold blood. They threw the book at him. We spent all the money that we had on his defense, even though he tried to tell us not to. But no matter how much we worked to argue that Shane hadn't a clue what he was doing that night, we couldn't prove it, and the court wanted to see justice for such a heinous crime. He was given a sentence of 30 years to life and hauled off to the state penitentiary with us, barely having time to say goodbye. For the next 10 years, I visited him as often as possible, and he called me whenever they'd let him. Mom and I had ended up destitute again after the trial, and our hopes of moving on to better things were dashed. She fell back into her old ways, and I was left with the burden of trying to keep us both afloat. Worse than she was before, she wasn't able to hold down steady work, and I had to take on several jobs to pay our bills. No matter her faults, she was still my mother, and she had been good to me for years. I couldn't just leave her to die in squalor. Mine and Shane's dreams, or me going to college once I graduated high school, evaporated. Yet Shane remained optimistic. It's one thing that never ceased to amaze me about him. All those years he spent grinding when I was younger, all throughout his trial, and even throughout his time in prison, he always kept a positive outlook, always wore a smile. Better times were just around the corner in his mind, and he continued to encourage me in every one of our conversations that we'd figure it all out someday. But I knew he was having a hard time with his sentence. He wanted desperately to get out to help me and Mom, and his living conditions were awful. He tried his best to hide it, but he looked sickly whenever I saw him, and often bore the marks of having been in fights. The little food that he did receive made him ill, and he mentioned that he sometimes had to sleep on the floor if they ran out of bunks. My brother had just been trying to make us a little extra money to improve our lives, and now he was suffering for it, and maybe would be for the rest of his life. Then, a few months ago, he called me and was far more excited to talk than usual. He told me that he'd been selected as a potential candidate for the prison's new early release program. At the time, he had 20 years left before he'd be eligible for parole, but if he agreed to participate, they'd set him free right away. As it was a new process, there'd be some additional oversight on his time outside. And if things weren't going well, he could still be brought back in, but it was a chance. That sounds way too good to be true. I said, "What's the catch?" Well, they said I'd have to undergo an experimental procedure, called it being ethically altered. Cutting-edge science, they say though. Apparently it removes your criminal tendencies or something and can guarantee that you'll never commit another crime. But the beauty is, I haven't really got any criminal tendencies in the first place, so it shouldn't do anything to me. He was speaking so quickly, I barely caught it all. I was hesitant. I don't know, Shane. I don't like the idea of you being used like some kind of lab rat. And what do they mean, ethically altered? That sounds, I don't know. Is it like a surgery they want to do on your brain? Yeah, I know it sounds a little off, but it's just a term the prison probably came up with to make it sound nice for the people outside. Anyway, they said no surgery, no drugs. They won't tell me exactly what the process is. Guess it's top secret shit. But apparently there's nothing physically invasive about it. My guess is they're going to strap me into a chair or something and put a helmet on me that'll pulse some kind of waves through my brain and try to rewire it to be more docile. For thinking that he might undergo a procedure that would potentially alter his brain, he was sounding remarkably nonchalant. Dude, that sounds super sketchy. If they won't tell you what exactly they're going to do to you, what if it fucks up your brain? What if it kills you? I was growing less convinced that this was a good idea with every word. It won't kill me. They gave a guarantee of that. Yes, they said it will change me, but, like I said, they were talking about removing my criminal tendencies, and you know that I'm not really a serious criminal or anything. Look, this is an opportunity for us, Jack. 10 minutes. That's how long they said the whole process takes. 10 minutes, and I'm back with you and Mom. 10 minutes, and we can get our lives back on track. I can get a job, and we can save up money again. You'll go to college. It'll be just like we planned. Mom will probably even get out of her shit spiral and start helping out again. His last few sentences made me realize that he hadn't been calling to ask for my opinion on his participation in the program. You've already signed up, haven't you? I asked him. He paused. I love you, little brother. The line went dead. I didn't hear from him again after that. He normally called once every few days, but the phone didn't ring for a week. When I got a day off work, I drove up to the prison to see him in person. But I was told that I couldn't. He was apparently sick and in the infirmary. I told them that he had been talking about participating in the new early release program and asked if his illness was related. They told me that he just had the flu. However, they also said that there was no new early release program that they were aware of. Leaving them with a message to have him call me as soon as he was feeling better, I went home with a pit in my stomach. Something was wrong. In all the years he'd been inside, Shane and I had never gone this long without speaking. Sure, he'd gotten very sick a few times, but he'd always called before heading to the infirmary to let me know he might be out of touch for a little while. And why hadn't they known about the early release program? Were they lying? Did something go wrong with the process and they were trying to cover it up? Or had it really been so top secret that not everyone in the prison was privy to the information? In any case, I knew all I could do for the time was wait. Another week passed without a call, and I made another trip to the prison, where I received the same story. He was still sick, and I couldn't see him. I was more forceful this time, and demanded that they let me visit him in the infirmary if he was really that ill. They told me that that would be impossible. It wasn't until they threatened to escort me out physically and not allow me back for future visits that I finally capitulated and left of my own accord. After the third week with no word from Shane, I was convinced that something terrible had happened to him, and the prison was trying to hide it. I called up there so much, asking for information on him or this program, that they blocked my number, and I was on the brink of writing directly to the government when my phone rang. It wasn't Shane, it was someone from the prison informing me that we could come pick him up the next day. He was being released on parole. That was it. I started to try to reply with questions, but they cut me off, just saying, "He'll be available at noon," before hanging up on me. I couldn't believe it. 3 weeks of radio silence, and now, suddenly, he was getting out. They were really letting him go. I was going to have my brother back. But any excitement of mine at having him returned was tempered with wondering what state he'd be in when we brought him home. They put him away believing that he had potentially had a large part in planning the murder of an innocent man and woman, one of them being a member of law enforcement. What had they done to him that made them so convinced he was no longer a danger to society? I only needed to wait until we picked him up the following day to understand why they weren't worried about him anymore. Shane had been right about one thing. Mom was different with the prospect of him coming home. She only had half her normal morning helping of vodka and actually ironed her clothes, although her hands were shaking so badly as she did it that it didn't help much. We even had our first real conversation in years about how things were going to be okay now that he was coming back. Yet, when we saw him, we quickly realized that it wasn't going to be the homecoming we'd hoped for. Shane was different. The smile that he always wore was gone. In fact, all the life that normally filled his face seemed to be missing. He wore a vacant expression and stared into the distance as if he recognized nothing in front of him. When I called his name, he turned to face me, but it was as if he only did it because he recognized the word Shane and not his brother's voice. I wrapped him in a hug and asked if he was okay, told him how happy I was to see him and that he was free. He didn't hug me back. His arms lay stiff at his sides. Shane had always been a big hugger, especially with me, and I'd expected that on his first day of freedom, he'd give me a huge squeeze. I got nothing. Pulling back, I grew worried. "Shane, what the hell? Are you okay? What did they do to you?" I shook him slightly as I asked. "I feel okay." He responded, so mechanically that I could scarcely recognize his voice from the AI ones that are used for voiceovers. Just when I was about to begin screaming at the guards that were helping escort him to explain what was wrong with him, a thin, dark-haired woman in a lab coat approached us and introduced herself as Dr. Kotick, head of the new program. "Are you Shane's brother?" she asked. "He listed you as his post-release guardian." "Yeah, I am." "What the fuck did you do to him?" I snapped at her. She considered me coolly. "Your brother is one of the first people to undergo a revolutionary new process that is going to change the way we handle criminal justice in this country. No longer will we need to lock away the worst members of our society forever. We'll be able to give them the alteration, and they'll be able to rejoin the rest of us. You should be proud of him," she said, with an air of condescension. "That's not my brother." I didn't like her superior attitude. Shane has never stood still for more than 10 seconds in my entire life. Look at him. Shane hadn't moved an inch from where the guard that was escorting him stopped him when we walked up. He looked over towards me and Dr. Kotick whenever he heard the word Shane, but then, realizing we weren't speaking directly to him, turned his head straight forward again and stared blankly into space. "You need to lower your voice." She bore an expression of annoyance. "I understand that the effects of the process may be shocking at first, but you'll see, in time, that he's better off this way. You have to remember that your brother committed a heinous crime, and likely would have done something similar in the future had we let him out via the normal practice. In any case, the effects cannot be reversed. What we need to discuss now is the path forward." "Fuck you, lady." I was seething. "You don't know shit about him. He was innocent. He was a good man. And what do you mean the effects can't be reversed? You change him back. Change him back now. I don't care if he sits in here for the rest of his life. At least he'll be himself." She was starting to mark some things off on a clipboard, and I could tell was only half listening to me. Looking up, she began, "Again, the process is irreversible, and you'll find that your brother signed a binding agreement to participate in this trial. He's been evaluated over the last several weeks by medical staff and government officials, and everyone is on board with moving forward with Phase 2, public reintroduction. At this point, you have two options. Option 1, You can sign this and you'll get to take your brother home. For the first month, you'll call me daily to discuss how he's doing, and we will make periodic home visits to inspect in person. We'll help him get work so he can start contributing to society again like a law-abiding citizen. You will not disclose anything about this process to anyone. And if anyone should ask how he got out early or why he's acting so differently, you'll simply say that he's been reformed and he was released early due to good behavior and overcrowding. Any violation of these terms, and he will be brought right back here, and you will lose all future visitation privileges. Option 2. You don't sign this and we take your brother right back inside now, and you also lose all future visitation privileges. And before you start spouting off about legality or suing us or anything of that nature, she could obviously see the fury in my eyes. You should know that we have backing from the highest levels. Your case would go nowhere. Now, if you could hurry up and make your decision, please. I have several more of these to do today. She returned to her clipboard. I was shaking with anger. Clearly, to her, Shane was nothing more than a variable in her experiment. He wasn't a person, a brother, a friend, a human at all. Just a note on her clipboard. An alteration for her to study. But what choice did I have? She had all the power, and she knew it. If I fought her or refused, she'd take Shane away, and I'd never see him again. And if he'd been living poorly before, it would be nothing to how I imagined him living inside now, sitting on his bed day in and day out, wasting away with that blank stare on his face. Wrenching the clipboard from her hands, I signed the agreement. We rode home in near silence. Both Mom and I tried to ask Shane questions about the process he underwent, but all he could tell us was, "I don't remember." I was just about to ask him what he did remember, to see if he even really knew who we were when he abruptly announced, "I am tired. I need sleep." Again, his voice had no emotion behind it. It sounded as if a computer was reading off lines of code. Wondering now if they'd turned him into some sort of cyborg, I looked in the rear view, half expecting to see red eyes staring back at me, but I was surprised to find he'd already fallen asleep. Instantly, as soon as he'd said it, he'd needed sleep. He went to sleep, like it was the next line in a command string. I made a plan to go over his entire body with the metal detecting wand that I had at home from one of my security jobs as soon as we got through the door. When we arrived at the apartment complex and parked the car, he was still snoring. I had to open the back door and shake him slightly to wake him. In the past, when I'd woken him from a deep slumber, he'd always been a little grumpy. It was the only time I was cautious around him. On instinct, I stood slightly back as he opened his eyes, awaiting a tirade of frustration and asking for 5 more minutes, but he just stared straight ahead again. "Shane," I said his name. He turned to look at me, but didn't reply. "Hey, we're home. You can get out of the car now, and we can go inside." I wondered how much of his behavior was due to the alteration, and how much might be due to him having been in prison for 10 years and always having to be told what to do. Okay, his vocal cords made the sound, but it's hard to describe. It wasn't his voice. I know that doesn't make much sense, but I've heard that voice for 24 years. I know the quality, the cadence, the inflection. It just wasn't his. Mom had already given up. She'd started crying on the drive home, and the minute we parked, she'd run upstairs. I knew to go hit the bottle, or maybe something stronger. Shane exited the car, and I closed the door behind him. Surprisingly, he started walking towards the elevators like he knew where he was going. I decided not to say anything and see if he remembered where he lived. He hit the up button as he should have, and he selected the correct floor once he was inside. When we exited on our floor, he made a direct line for our unit. I followed him closely and watched as he opened the door, just as he'd done hundreds of times before. However, he stopped right after stepping through the threshold and stood stock still again. I nearly crashed into him. He seemed to be waiting on the next set of instructions, so I told him to go sit at the kitchen table for now. "Okay." The voice came again. Just as I'd planned to do on the drive back, I ran my wand all over his body and found he had no metal inside of him. I felt his head for signs of stitching or scarring and discovered nothing. I checked every inch of exposed skin for surgical markings, but at least to my untrained eye, he was clean. The entire time I did my examination, Shane didn't move, nor did his expression change. That blank stare just fixated on the wall in front of him, and I got the impression I could do nearly anything to him, and he wouldn't respond. I sat down at the table across from him and started asking the questions that I'd wanted to ask in the car. "Hey, Shane." His eyes met mine, and it was only then that we were sitting down and I was looking directly into them that I truly saw that there was nothing behind them. Whatever it was that made Shane was gone. I was looking only at a collection of cells, a biological mass that could walk and talk, but had no personality, had no life. It terrified me. My voice quivered as I asked, "Shane, do you remember your full name?" "Yes." "What is it?" "Shane Theodore Thompson." It was like he was recalling data stored away in a hard drive. "Do you know who I am?" "Yes." "Who am I to you and what is my full name?" "You are my brother, Jack Francis Thompson." "How old are we?" "I am 36 and you're 24. I was happy to see that he at least knew who he was and who I was, but this was all information they could have had him memorize at the prison. I wanted to ask something more personal to see if he really had all of Shane's memories. "Who did you lose your virginity to and where did it happen?" "Elise Sherman and in her parents' basement." Now this story was one that Shane and I had laughed about often. Elise's father had come downstairs while they were in the middle of the deed, and he chased Shane out of the house with Shane's pants around his ankles. It woken the neighbors, and several of them got an eyeful of Shane's business while he desperately tried to pull his pants up and dive back into his car. But this time, he relayed the information with no humor, no crack of a smile, remembering the absurdity of it all. The information was there, in his head, but it was as if he had no connection to it. I realized that they hadn't removed his criminal tendencies, as they told him they were going to do. They'd removed him. I don't know how they did it, and at the time I still wasn't sure what they'd done, but I knew that he wasn't there anymore. Shane's body was sitting right in front of me, but my brother had died somewhere in that prison. Over the next several weeks, I kept my agreement with Dr. Kochik. I called her daily and informed her of how things were progressing with Shane. There weren't really any changes to report. As she'd stated they would, they helped him secure a job at the local grocery store, and she checked in on him in person twice. She couldn't have been more delighted with the success of her program. If you could really call it that, I surely didn't. Yes, Shane hadn't committed any crimes and seemed highly unlikely to ever do so, but Shane also hadn't done much of anything. He was operating on what I would have called pure animal instinct, outside of being given direct instructions. When he was hungry, he ate. Thirsty, he drank when he needed to use the restroom or sleep. He did that as well, but beyond that I had to tell him to do anything. Shower, brush his teeth, get dressed, go to work. At the grocery store, he had to be given specific tasks by his boss, and he was able to perform them perfectly. But he took no initiative beyond doing exactly what he was told to do. And that's what it seemed our lives would be from then on. Shane had given so much of his life for me, sacrificed his entire future. I didn't mind helping him for once, and decided that I would continue to support him in this state until the day that one of us died. But then last week, something changed. Shane and I share a bedroom, and I awoke around 3 a.m. to an odd scratching noise. We're no strangers to rats in our building, but this was different, and it was coming from near Shane's bed. I walked over to investigate, using my cell phone light to check for vermin. I couldn't find anything. And as I approached, the noise simply stopped. Too tired to care much, I went back to sleep with plans to look into it more in the morning. Yet in the morning, those plans were driven straight out of my mind. It was the smell of bacon that woke me the second time, and I opened my eyes in confusion. Mom hadn't gotten up to make breakfast in years, and Shane hadn't cooked anything since his return. He just ate pre-made meals or leftovers from the fridge. Rolling over, I saw that Shane's bed was empty, and I sat up quickly in astonishment. I'd had to tell him to get out of bed every morning since he came back. What was going on? Then I heard it. Laughter. Shane's laughter drifted through the doorway. Him and my mom were having an animated conversation in the kitchen. I heard my name through the cackles. Bleary-eyed, I walked in to join them, and saw that Shane was at the stove, happily frying up breakfast, while Mom was at the table smiling and having a cigarette. "Speak of the devil," Mom said, and Shane spun around. He ran over to me, spatula still in hand, and wrapped me in a massive hug. Stunned, I only feebly returned it as he said, "Good morning, little brother. So glad you're awake. We were just talking about the time that you tried to make me a birthday cake and you mixed up the salt and the sugar." He started laughing hard and pulled back. I was at a loss for words. He was acting just like his old self? Was I dreaming? As he tried to step back towards the stove, I grabbed his face with both of my hands and looked directly into his eyes. There was life there again. But still, there was something off about them. A darkness I didn't remember from before. There was a sudden flash of black and I leapt back, gasping. "What's the matter, Jack? Still shocked at how much better looking I am than you?" He laughed some more and went back to his cooking. "It was a trick of the light," I told myself. Just be happy that he's acting like himself again. Maybe after a few weeks, the effects lessen or something. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a coldness in Shane's laughter that hadn't been there before. Whatever my reservations, we had the best family breakfast we'd had since Shane was put away. We reminisced about old times, talked about our future. I nearly cried at how happy I was to have my brother truly returned. After he left for work, I called Dr. Kochik to give my update, and I debated whether I should tell her the truth. Shane's behavioral change was positive in my view, but she might not see it the same way. Maybe she'd want to take him back and do the process over again. But the first words out of her mouth when she picked up were, "Is he acting differently today?" She sounded anxious. Her tone made me nervous. Maybe something had gone wrong with some of the other participants. Yeah, he was acting like his old self this morning. He even got up and made breakfast," I replied. "Did you notice anything strange about him?" How did she know? Nothing serious. I just thought there was a kind of, I don't know, his eyes looked different. What's going on? Shit, just hang tight. I'll come out and check in on him tomorrow. And she suddenly hung up. My heart was hammering. She knew something. She'd been expecting exactly what I told her. I tried to call her back, but it went straight to voicemail. For the rest of the day, I tried to act as normally as possible, just as she'd instructed. I went to work myself, but had a hard time concentrating. I wondered how Shane would be that evening. But when he returned from his shift, he did so with a bag full of groceries in his arms, and announced loudly that he was going to make us a 5-star meal. Seeing his smiling face pushed my concerns down, and I chalked Dr. Kochik's behavior up to her process possibly failing. Maybe whatever she'd done had reversed itself, and she was not, in fact, going to revolutionize criminal justice in this country. With that thought, I wondered if this might be the last night I'd have with my brother before they hauled him back to the prison to do more tests or simply lock him away again. I decided if that was the case, that I should stop my worrying and just enjoy the evening with my family. We ate, we drank, we laughed, we sang. It was a perfect night, until we fell asleep. I awoke again around 3 a.m. The scratching had returned, louder this time, and I looked over towards Shane's bed. "Fuck!" I whisper-yelled as I sat up and slid back towards the wall. Shane was sitting bolt upright in his bed with his feet down on the floor. He was glaring at me. There was a malevolent grin on his face, illuminated by the digital clock on his nightstand. "The fuck are you doing, man?" I yelped. There was something about his presence. It was dark and heavy. It made the air around me oppressive, and I was struggling to get full breaths in. He didn't reply, just kept watching me. His eyes were cold, and as I stared into them, I caught movement behind him. A shadow was crawling across his wall, a shadow with red eyes and long, spindly fingers. He opened his mouth and a voice, voices that I did not recognize emanated from it. "Shh, go back to sleep, little brother." There was no love behind the words. It was malice. It was evil. My eyelids sagged, and I collapsed back onto the bed. I tried to fight it, but exhaustion overcame me, and I fell back into a deep sleep. The next day, I didn't wake up until noon. Shane had already left for work, and I had 6 missed calls and a flurry of texts from my manager asking why I hadn't shown up for my shift. I played the events of the night before back in my mind and tried to tell myself it was a dream, that there was no way it could be real. But when I looked over at Shane's bed, I saw there were deep gouges in the wall behind it. Gouges that looked like they'd made by massive clawed hands. Something clicked into place. I formed a theory on what they'd done to Shane at the prison. I think they removed his soul. I don't know how they did it. I don't know if it was magic or if it was science, but I think the soul that had inhabited Shane's body, the very thing that made him who he was, has been ripped out. Dr. Kochik never showed up for her visit, and she stopped answering my calls. When I contacted the prison directly, they said a Dr. Kochik had never worked there, and told me there was no record of a Shane Theodore Thompson even serving time at the facility. They've abandoned us. They're trying to cover this up. He's getting worse by the day. He can move things without touching them. I've heard him speak in languages I can't understand. I'm sure this is happening to more of them that went through the process. To more of them that they ethically altered. Because I don't think they considered that if they removed the souls that inhabited these people, they left them open to be inhabited by something else.